I saw lots of first day of school photos on social media the last couple of days. So cute. My daughter starts tomorrow. Can't wait to take that picture. So school's on, and educators say that school is back to normal. No more pandemic stuff. But only kind of. What's missing? Too many kids. Trying to curb a crisis in chronic absenteeism at school. On today's Story of the Day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Long Run Wealth, an SEC-registered investment advisor in Lake Placid, providing comprehensive wealth management, retirement, and financial planning solutions. LongRunWealth.com. And from SciTech Business Solutions, training and consulting services to help businesses grow. More information at citec.org.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Wednesday, September 6th. First up, New York State released a long-awaited report earlier this week on recommendations for reducing road salt use in the Adirondacks. Kara Chapman has more.
The Randy Preston Road Salt Reduction Act was signed into law in 2020. It established a task force, pilot plan, and test program with the goal of decreasing road salt use in the Adirondacks. Road salt is a major pollutant in the region that contaminates lakes and residential water wells. The law said the task force would put out a report with its findings on road salt use and recommendations for how to use less of it in 2021. A 3-year pilot program for reducing road salt would start that year. But the task force itself wasn't even formed until 2021, and its report seemed to languish with state agencies. The Adirondack Explorer reported in May that members of the group were frustrated with the delays when they thought the document was largely completed. State agencies announced the release of the 27-page report on Tuesday, about 2 years after its original deadline. In it, the task force says an estimated 193,000 tons of road salt are applied to roads in the Adirondacks each year. The group outlines road salt's impacts on the environment, public health, property, and infrastructure. Recommendations for cutting back on road salt include setting reduction targets, snow and ice removal training, and providing public access to data about road salt usage. The task force additionally proposes several pilot programs. Among other things, those would look at managing cold spots where snow and ice build up on roadways, chloride-free zones, and seasonal speed warnings. The report says additional funding from federal, state, and local government sources will be necessary to implement the recommendations. Kara Chapman, North Country Public Radio.
The agency that oversees water flows on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River is trying to keep levels higher this fall for boaters in the Waddington and Massena areas. Catherine Wheeler explains how.
Water levels across the Great Lakes have been above their long-term average this past spring. And if water levels at Lake Ontario reach a certain height in September, typically it means more water is let out to bring those down. But this year, the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board says it won't authorize an increase in that outflow. It says Lake Ontario is on track to keep up with its seasonal decline and the risk of floods remains low. And low rainwater levels would impact boating and recreation on Lake St. Lawrence. The board says by deviating from the plan, it won't have to again lower levels for boats to be hauled out early next month. The board says it will keep more predictable water levels on Lake St. Lawrence as this year's weather conditions have made it favorable for boating. Catherine Wheeler, North Country Public Radio.
The manual locks between Middle and Lower Saranac Lakes are going to be closed for construction starting September 18th. The upper locks will get $1.6 million worth of maintenance and repairs, including refurbishing the lock, gates, and doors, replacing the concrete walls and floor, and replacing the downstream boat dock and shelter. The Department of Environmental Conservation says a company from Middlesex, Vermont will do the work. The locks will be closed for use until sometime next year. Canoes and kayaks can still carry around the locks during the construction. This is the first school year in 4 years with no official COVID-19 guidance of any kind from New York State. And yet, districts are still struggling with staff shortages and another lingering pandemic effect that everyone is grappling with, chronic absenteeism. NCPR's education reporter Amy Feiereisel reports.
Across the U.S., the number of students considered chronically absent, that means missing more than 18 days in a school year, nearly doubled during the coronavirus pandemic.
The attendance issues nationwide have just been awful, and we're no exception to that.
That's Principal Elaine Dixon Cross from the Boquete Valley Central School in Elizabethtown. In New York schools, the number of chronically absent students jumped from 19% in 2019 to 33% in 2022. Dixon Cross says that has everything to do with pandemic-era education. Remember remote school, 14-day quarantines, dropping attendance requirements.
All of those things combined became this loosey-goosey, not showing up late. So we've been trying to reel that back for the past 2 years, and now this year we really want to tighten it.
But she and other educators say it's not a straightforward task.
It's definitely a topic that we're struggling with from multiple angles.
Dale Brialt is superintendent for the Franklin Essex Hamilton BOCES. He says pre-COVID, the state was cracking down on attendance and charging parents with educational neglect if a student was chronically absent.
So that was the world we lived in for several years, of these very clearly articulated attendance policies.
The pandemic threw all that out the window. For the first time, perhaps ever, families were encouraged to keep kids home if they felt unwell. That's not necessarily a bad thing, says Brialt.
We've now started thinking about, well, really, should we be incentivizing student attendance, like through perfect attendance policies and things like that, when they really shouldn't be coming to school when they're sick?
But it's not the occasional sniffle that's accounting for all the absences. Brialt says there's a huge mental health component.
Students are just having a hard time walking through the door a lot of times. We are seeing a lot more students and staff, for that matter, struggling with mental health issues. And that I do think are a direct result of experiences during COVID.
At the same time, Brialt says the reality is there are deep academic impacts to being absent.
If students aren't actively attending school on a regular basis, the research clearly shows learning isn't going to happen.
An Economic Policy Institute study estimates that missing just 2 days of school can translate to academic losses equivalent to about 50 fewer days of learning. If that sounds far-fetched, here's a real-world case from Nick Lee, the principal of Evans Mills Primary School in Jefferson County.
Take literacy, for example. We are learning to read here, right? So that later on you can read to learn. But if you don't learn to read, then the next thing, it becomes more and more challenging.
And students are taking more elective absences. Even though schools haven't offered a remote option since 2021, educators say families still request it. They say families are more likely now to take kids away for a long trip, often to visit family or a sick relative.
I think parents got kind of comfortable with the idea that if their child was out, the school will make it up, or will send work, or will flip to virtual.
But there is no virtual option, says Evans Mills Vice Principal Vicki McCulloch. She says sick days and mental health days also add up, and many families don't realize how much school their child has missed until she lays it out.
And so it's really eye-opening to parents when you have the conversation, your child has missed 20 school days, and they're like, oh, and then you break that down into that's a month of school.
So schools are trying to solve the absenteeism problem, and they're leaning away from disciplinary action and towards something akin to social work. Evans Mills, like many schools across the country, has invested a lot of its COVID relief funding into more support staff and counselors. Lee says they're trying to identify and solve obstacles instead of penalizing families.
And we have seen so many amazing things come out of that. Maybe it's in regards to transportation. Maybe it's in regards to students not coming to school because they have anxiety or stress about not completing work. So what can we do to help them complete that?
Lee says a lot of chronic absenteeism, pre- and post-pandemic, is connected to the struggles that low-income families face every day.
Hygiene, showering, clean clothing, laundry. We have seen all of those problems solved here at Indian River over the last couple of years.
But this is a heavy lift for schools, and one they're barely equipped for, even if they want to be. Staffing shortages have made it much harder to hire counselors and in-school social workers. There's a dearth of therapists for kids with mental health issues. But it's crucial work, say educators. The well-being and futures of their students are at stake. Amy Feiereisel, North Country Public Radio.
We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Alan Dunham of South Glens Falls and Hank Soto of Stony Creek. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.